Stanford University.
Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Stacy Bent. I'm the director of the Tomcat Center for Sustainable Energy. I'm very pleased to welcome you all here for the first annual Connecting the Dots Symposium. We hope that this is going to be the first of many such gatherings examining interconnections between food, energy, water, and the environment, human health, and other grand challenges. The Tomcat Center, along with Stanford's Precourt Institute for Energy, the Program on Food Security and the Environment, the Woods Institute for the Environment, and the School of Earth Sciences have organized this afternoon's session to illustrate something that is all too easily overlooked or ignored, that the great global challenges of the century of providing clean, affordable energy, adequate food, and improved nutrition for all, clean water for people and ecosystems, a healthful society, a protected and sustained environment and planetary life support system, all of these challenges are tightly linked to each other. At Stanford, a great many faculty, staff, and students are working on each of these grand challenges individually. But the point we wish to make today, and that we will illustrate through the presentations in this afternoon's session, is that our research and teaching also focuses on the interconnections and linkages among them, hence the name Connecting the Dots. So the impetus for Connecting the Dots and the name itself came from one of our most important friends and supporters, Kat Taylor. Kat's interests, like ours, span the energy, food, water, health, and security continuum, and she encouraged us to share our knowledge of the connections among them with our students, colleagues, and friends from the community, something that we don't do often enough. So I'd like to especially acknowledge our appreciation of Kat and her husband, Tom Steyer. This year's symposium starts with the global food system at the center of the web, and then reaches out to connections with other crucial challenges. In future years, we may start with energy or water or human health or ecosystem health at the center, but this year we have food at the center. Our speakers come from many different disciplines and perspectives. We have economics, law, ecology, earth system science, and agronomy, but they all share an interest in finding solutions for the world's great challenges, and their expertise in one way or another all links back to food. So these promise to be very interesting discussions this afternoon. So our plan for today, as you can see on the agenda that I hope you all picked up as you checked in, is to first listen to a series of research presentations on aspects of this web of connections. Each of the presentations will be followed by a short question and answer period. After a break, we'll then split up into 6 different workshops or tutorials on different topics that are going to be led by Stanford student faculty teams. We're then going to return to a wrap-up panel discussion on the topic of the way forward, and we'll end the day with a reception and celebration of Earth Day. The food at the reception is going to be provided by our local sustainable caterer, Jesse Cool. So I see if several of you are familiar with Jesse Cool. So let me cover a few housekeeping notes before we start the program. Restrooms, always number one, are located on either side of the auditorium inside the building. Regarding slides, you will find the slides for both the faculty talks and the student tutorials on the Connecting the Dots website. So that's connectingthedots.stanford.edu. And the faculty talks will also be posted soon on Stanford's YouTube. So once those are available, we'll send an email to all registered attendees telling you where to find them. For those of you that feel a need to get on the internet while you're here, the guest username and password for internet access can be found on the agenda that you picked up. Okay, so now with that, I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, Roz Naylor. Roz is a professor in the Department of Environmental Earth System Science and Wrigley Senior Fellow in the Woods Institute for the Environment. She leads the Food Security and Environment Center, which resides jointly in the Woods Institute and the Friedman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Her research focuses on the environmental and equity dimensions of intensive food production, as well as issues of aquaculture production, high-input agricultural development, biotechnology, and food security. Roz will be presenting a big picture view of the global food challenge as a context for the Nexus talks that will follow. Roz.
Thanks, Stacy. It's great to be here with so many friends and students and colleagues, and wonderful to have agriculture and food as the focus for Earth Day today. So I'm very pleased, actually, just to have the opportunity to talk about the work that we've been doing really at the intersection of energy, climate, food, water, and human security, broadly defined, which we've been doing for about 20 years now, and many of you have been involved in this work. So it's great to be able to highlight some of the themes and some of the current and past research projects we've been working on. As Stacy said, I'm the director of the program on food security and the environment, which sits between the Woods Institute and the Freeman Spogli Institute. And when I think about the challenges for the 21st century, there's really three broad challenges. How are we going to feed a more populous world and a richer world in the decades to come? The population's going towards 9 billion people. Many countries, particularly the emerging economies, are becoming richer with new demands on the food systems. And how are we going to do that with more resource constraints, and particularly with global climate change? And do so without destroying the environment. You know, this is a nice, simple topic to take on for the day. But I want to add the second topic. You know, meanwhile, how are we also going to provide food access to the roughly 1 billion people globally who live day in and day out with chronic hunger? As a global community, I think we've been pretty much of a failure in terms of getting on top of the global hunger situation. And in the context of global hunger, really, how do we address food insecurity within the more traditional boundaries of national security discussions? And Tino Cuellar is here today to introduce that area. So the way I define food security, and I'll be using it today, is when all people at all times have both the physical and the economic access for the food necessary for a healthy and a productive life. There's an availability, pile of grain question, there's an economic poverty question at stake here, and then a nutrition question at stake as well. And if we look at the poverty food security nexus, the World Bank, for example, estimates that about 15% of the world's population, the billion people, live under $1 a day, now defined as $1.25 a day. And a whopping 50% live under $2 a day. So there's a huge portion of the world's population that is very vulnerable to being in a food insecure state. When we look regionally at where the food insecure actually are, we tend to think about Africa as just having huge high rates of hunger and malnutrition, which is true. But in fact, 2/3 of the world's malnourished population is in Asia. India, for example, over a quarter of the population is malnourished. And in China, which has phenomenal economic growth and development, 100 to 130 million people are still living day in and day out in chronic hunger. And that rural to urban divide is a huge source of tension for China. Many of you are probably reading about China's real concern for food price inflation right now, and particularly for the security, the political security concerns that go along with that. We're in a world now, if we had had this talk maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it would have been a different talk, because we're really in a world now where globalization is at full pitch. Commodities are moving all over the world, and there's transactions that are occurring by the minute in financial markets that are linked to commodity markets. There's large retail chains that are providing food at cheaper cost, but not necessarily internalizing the cost. And some large players like Walmart are trying to reverse that trend now. But I think this picture suggests that we're not only dealing with a malnutrition problem globally, we're also dealing with an obesity problem globally. And so how we think about nutrition and how we feed the world, what do we want to feed the world with, is of crucial importance. And I put the picture again of China to say that even in the most successful countries, as we think of them in terms of economic growth, it doesn't necessarily equate to good nutrition. It's a really timely talk. The Economist just ran a whole volume on the 9 billion people question, how are we going to feed the world? This is a picture actually from the Cerrado in Brazil. And when I think of the world food problem, I think of this. This is meant for you to say, wow, that's complex, because it's really complex. At the top, you have corn, wheat, and soy prices, the major staple commodities. These prices for these commodities are as high now as they were in 2008, when there was huge reporting on the world food crisis. And the prices have been incredibly volatile and driven by all sorts of features. So the economist in me likes to say, well, there's a whole set of demand features. There's population growth, there's income growth and growing demand for meat and fish, which rely on crops like soy and wheat and corn for feed. There's this whole energy growth, and are we going to fuel our automobiles, for example, with the oncoming fleets in China, with biofuels based on crops? The United States has had a huge biofuel push here. And with all these demand forces, the picture on the far right is our stocks, our global stocks and our national stocks of grain, which have been extremely low. And in fact, all the expectations around this have sent all sorts of price signals and price instability in the international markets. Of course, on the supply side, we face a whole host of issues that we're going to talk in depth about today. Climate, for example. This is a picture of China this year and its very prolonged drought in its major grain belt in the north. And we've seen a lot of weather shocks in this past year that have sent also these ripples into the market. And we're clearing land for cattle production, crop production, which is also fueling climate change. And so there's all these features, and you think, oh my God, this is just too overwhelming to take on. We actually make our students take this on in a 9-week course on the world food economy. Not only do they have to take an exam, they actually have to model this quantitatively. And they do a phenomenally good job. And so it's my task today to give you the elevator talk of what they said and how we think these are all connected. The biofuels boom itself, which will be discussed in more detail later, we tend to think, okay, there's all this talk about biofuels in 2008, and then it kind of subsided. But just looking at this picture on the left here, biofuels are still alive and well, and in fact, really increasing globally in production volumes, driven mainly by U.S. corn ethanol, and secondly, by Brazilian sugar ethanol. And when we look at the links between corn, which is plotted on the right there in the red, and crude oil, which is in the blue down below, these prices have not gone really in tandem until about 2006, when we really put on these ethanol policies. And now you see these prices marching right together. And so now, if you're in the agriculture and food business, you really need to understand energy. You have to know about the energy sector entirely. And so this is what we're going to hear more of. We're now using about 40% of our corn crop for ethanol, which is a huge amount, especially considering that the U.S. typically exports about 55% of the world market. I mean, supplies about 55% of the world market. So for farmers in Iowa, this is Wally Falcon's farm. If he's looking fat and happy today, they're doing pretty well, actually. And all this is translated through land values and incomes in the United States. So the billion-dollar question for the day and for our lifetime really is, how are we going to pull this off? How are we going to meet all these demands with all the resource constraints? And traditionally, we've been thinking about it in terms of intensification. How can we take the existing land we have and use high-yielding cultivars, which rely on nitrogen fertilizers and irrigation water, and get increased yields? The Green Revolution was all about this pattern, and you saw a doubling or tripling of yields and total production in many developing countries, particularly in Asia and Latin America. And so that has been a huge push on the production side, but also on the resource side. Now, down below, we have our fearless leader, Pam Matson, who many of you know is the Dean of Earth Sciences here at Stanford. Many of us in this field actually know her as one of the world's leading ecologists and biogeochemists who focus on agriculture. And Pam, I have to admit, to the dismay of many of you, she's actually really much more happy when she's sitting in the field here measuring nitrogen fluxes. She's really quite happy there. And Pam and I and several others, Wally Falcon and others, began an interdisciplinary project in early 1990s in the home of the Green Revolution for wheat, which was Mexico, Sonora, Mexico. where we actually had a very large interdisciplinary project looking at what does intensification mean for the environment across a wide range of pathways that we'll learn about today. In fact, this is coming out as a volume in Island Press with Pam at the lead later this year, and I think it just amplifies the interdisciplinary work we've been doing for so long here that has been very successful, and many farmers, as I'll mention later, have changed their practices. At the core of what Pam's interested in, Peter Vitusik in ecology and others, is how biogeochemical cycles are altered by these human activities, particularly by agriculture. And as much as we need nitrogen fertilizer to improve yields and get the production, only 30 to 40% of that nitrogen actually is taken up by the plant. The rest is lost through various pathways, nitrate leaching into the groundwater or surface waters, through a wide range of fluxes, NOx, which is a regional to local greenhouse gas, or regional air pollutant, and nitrous oxide, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. And so we're adding more nitrogen actually to the biosphere now than is fixed naturally. And most of this, the majority now, is coming from agriculture. Peter Vitusik has led a team actually looking at this phenomenon around the world and the role that nitrogen fertilizer has played in different systems. In China, for example, it's an incredibly productive system, very, very high yields in their northern wheat and corn belt, but they're adding and subsidizing the fertilizer sector to such an extent that they're actually adding on net 227 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. For those of you in this field, you'll know that's a large number, and for those of you who aren't, let me just tell you, that is a really, really large number. And how we reverse that will really take the will of Chinese policymakers to think carefully about the loss and the environmental impact of their activities. So many people might say, well, fertilizer's bad. Okay, it's adding to all these environmental problems, just let's not use it. But in fact, in Africa, where we're finding so much malnutrition and poverty, they don't have any fertilizer. A lot of farmers aren't using any fertilizer or just a few kilograms, and they're actually mining the soils, 52 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. And they actually really need fertilizers. And so we've looked across this spectrum of continuum of development, and I think it's been a really interesting experiment. We all know some of the implications of this, the loss of nitrogen and nutrients through the Mississippi into the dead zones. These are critical issues we'll hear more about as we go along. It's not just crop agriculture, it's also livestock and our meat economy. And I'm one of those people who loves to be out in the field talking to farmers. And this is a farmer in Iowa who was telling me about his production systems relative to his father's. And he runs 2,100 head of cattle with a maize operation here. And his corn yields are 4 times what his dad got. He's buying these calves and then he's growing them out to slaughter weight. And they're adding 4 pounds a day. It's roughly twice the weight gain that his dad was getting when he was doing the farming. And the grow out is much shorter, so they can run more cattle in a short amount of time, 170-day grow out versus 280. So this is the kind of intensification we're seeing on the livestock side too, with hormone implants and so forth. And we're seeing it across a wide spectrum of animals, from poultry to dairy to hogs, even aquaculture with the fisheries collapse. And this is really due to income growth, technology, global trade, and so forth. So this is a phenomenon. As incomes grow, more people are eating meat and moving into these dimensions of the food economy. I always like to steal the Atlantic Monthly's inconvenient trough motto because, in fact, this is a huge contribution to global greenhouse gases, about 18% through land use change for fertilizer that's used for the feeds, the waste methane released from ruminants. And it really is putting a lot of stress on land and water systems as well, as we'll hear more. So should we go to grass-fed beef? Is that a better alternative? You're actually going to have a breakout session by Chris Fetter and Kate Hyder on this. But they'll be asking you, how much land would it take to transition the whole U.S. beef sector from grain into grass-fed beef? And this is assuming current consumption patterns and the productivity of pasture. And what their answer is that we're going to need 61% more land to do this. 100 million hectares. That's 5 times the crop acreage of Iowa to get this done. Unless, of course, we consume less, and Americans a huge amount of meat, about 120 kilograms per capita per year. It's about 50% higher than even Europe. So you're wondering, how did you get those numbers? This is why you have to go to the breakout group and hear Chris and Kate talk about the analytics that we do behind all these issues I'm talking about today. We also have very large water issues when we think about just shipping pork and poultry over to Japan. Japan's getting the pork and poultry, but they're actually importing a huge amount of water in the process from the feeds that are coming from like the United States, where we are using a lot of our water. And so there's this virtual water transfer you'll hear from Buzz Thompson later on. And when we actually look around the globe, the water shortages are one of our biggest constraints I think we need to keep worrying about. Everyone knows this, but this is just a map that shows the physical scarcity of water in red and the economic scarcity, just no money and infrastructure to make water available to farmers, that's in the yellow. And there's a lot of cross-hatching of both issues. But about a third of the world's population will suffer from water scarcity by 2025, and we may feel great, okay, in the United States, so we're blue. This is good. We have enough water, but we're pumping that groundwater. Rebecca Nelson, in her breakout session, is going to talk about what all this means to our water supplies and our ecosystems. So speaking of water, we intensify other things besides land. We're intensifying our fish production, too. We've pretty much fished out our fisheries at about 80 million metric tons. And now we're transitioning to aquaculture, growing fish in different confined systems, which accounts for about 1/2. 1 out of 2 fish you eat is coming from aquaculture. And there's a whole host of issues, waste and spread of disease, pathogens, and so forth. And very importantly, on the right, the use of pelagic fish, anchovies, sardines, and so forth, to feed these marine finfish. Now, you may think marine finfish, pretty small component of the overall question, but in the United States, that's what we like to eat. We like to eat salmon and shrimp and salmon and tuna and so forth, and shrimp also uses these feed inputs. And it's different than wild fish eating those feed inputs, because wild fish are doing it in an ecosystem balance. In aquaculture, we catch it in Peru, ship it to China, ship it to Norway, and so forth, and everything through trade is now out of ecological balance. You may think when you're eating fish, okay, I've got fresh fish from Chile. That means you have an aquaculture salmon that's from Chile, and the retailer has specified, I want that salmon dynamo red 365 days out of the year, and it's got to be the same cut, same size, and that's what you're getting. Okay, so it's an industrial process now. And are we just replicating the feedlots of the sea? You know, if we think about having one net pen off the coast of California, okay, dilution can be a solution to that. But to make it economically viable, of course, we need more than one net pen. In fact, we need a whole host of net pens. And then we do have some waste issues that are going to be associated with this. We've been working with Jeff Kosseff and Oliver Finger and others in the Fluid Dynamics Laboratory in the Civil Engineering Department to just model this waste. And in fact, solution isn't the dilution. It doesn't just spread out equally. It remains very cohesive with the currents and with the bathymetry. And what you see after 6 cycle is in the yellow and red is when you see a cohesive waste. You see that waste starting to move down the coast, and in 60 cycles you have just a big stream of waste from moving right down the coast. This is a modeling exercise. It may look somewhat similar to Monterey Bay for you, but this is the thing. If you're living down south of Monterey Bay, you wouldn't want those net pens in Monterey Bay. And so this kind of integrative work and interdisciplinary work, I think, has been really important, and there'll be a poster on that. There's no single recipe for aquaculture. There's so many different kinds of systems, as I showed here, on land and on shore, and the mollusks tend to be pretty good. So you might ask, what fish should we buy? And that is what Andy Gerhardt and Dane Klinger are going to answer in their breakout session today. So not everything is intensification. In some ways, it would be better to just have to worry about that, but in fact, we are still expanding our land for agriculture in a fairly major way. The top is in Brazil, Amazon, and the bottom is in Indonesia, tropical rainforest for oil palm. And you think, okay, how much of the growth in, say, soybeans that Brazil is growing, which is moving into the Cerrado and into the Amazon now, is coming through land expansion versus just yield increases? And how much of this oil palm, which you can see here, is coming from land expansion versus yield expansion? Here are the numbers, almost all of it. Okay, these are huge oilseed markets that are feeding into livestock industries, potentially into biofuel industries, a lot of other commercial processes. And the market is hot for these commodities, especially down below from China and India and so forth, high growth economies. There's also this phenomenon of land grabs that's going on. A number of you are in the financial markets, I recognize you, and you know yields are really low. And some of you have even asked me, should I be investing in land in California or around the world? Well, a lot of people are doing that. In 2008, 2009, 42 million hectares were sold through these kinds of transactions. That's 10 times the amount that was on average for the decade, each year, the decade prior to that. So you have this big land speculation issue going on. 75% is in Africa. And particularly in countries with weak institutions seem to be underutilized in an agricultural sense. But what it really means for smallholders, what it means for all the ecological issues we care about, greenhouse gases, water resources, all of this is pretty much up for grabs. It's not just happening from investors like asset management funds or the Stanford Endowment Fund, but which I don't think they're doing, by the way. But it's also happening from countries like China and Saudi Arabia that are interested in having food secures. And in Indonesia, when we were there last summer, 1.6 million hectares were sold in the island of West Papua, which was Irian Jaya. It's the most pristine rainforest in Southeast Asia. I say 1.6 million hectares was sold. This was virtually given away to 5 companies, all of whom are major oil palm companies. And they say they're going to feed the world. There's no labor, no infrastructure, nothing over there. This is really feed the companies' bottom line through selling the forest timber revenue. And so it's a really interesting and very challenging situation that we have before us. Just to make it slightly more challenging, since David Lavelle is going to talk about this, we have climate change really upon us, and we all know that it's here. This is in Australia. We tend to focus on drought a lot with agriculture and climate, but in fact, the models tend to be a lot better and in much more agreement on temperature. And so when we look at temperature effects on agriculture, we just have to look at the huge heat wave we saw in Russia last year. And this was in the main wheat growing region, and Russia is a huge supplier of wheat in the global market. The blue bars there are, for the past 100 years, 1900 to 2006, the distribution of temperatures around the mean, some cold years, some warm years. And that red dot was last year, way out of bounds. I mean, it was phenomenal. It has disrupted the wheat markets and everything that substitutes for wheat in the markets to such an enormous extent. In fact, they still have an export ban that they've continued throughout the remainder of this calendar year. So in the future, are we going out of bounds? If you think of red dots, where will be the places in the world where the growing seasons, the temperature will be completely out of bounds of anything that's ever been experienced in recorded history? Here. Okay, this is the tropics and subtropics where we're entering a new world. So David Lavelle, luckily, is going to talk about this and solve all these problems for you. But I think that really we raised some very critical agriculture, energy, and climate linkages here. There's been a lot of talk as we intensify, aren't we just using so much energy and actually making greenhouse gases worse? And what is the energy requirements of food? Jen Burney is going to lead a breakout session on this, and Chris Field is going to talk about the energy issue in quite depth. But even on how we develop our energy, biofuels, and we have fertilizers that are leading to hypoxia versus the oil spill. I mean, there's all these trade-offs out there that we need to grapple with as a community. So let's put our innovative minds to work. You know, I think of 4 main areas: technology, management, policy, and consumption. And you can think of others, of course. But technology, I just want to give one example in each area. As I mentioned, so much of the developing world just has a shortage of water, and often it's a shortage of energy just to lift the water that much distance, either out of the groundwater or surface water to get to a plot to be able to eliminate an 8-month dry season. 90% of Africa's agriculture is rain-fed and has these long dry seasons. Jen Burney actually designed this directly coupled system which uses solar voltaic cells and couples them directly to transporting water into a reservoir. You don't need batteries, is what I'm trying to say here. And uses high-quality drip irrigation materials to irrigate high-valued crops. And this is working phenomenally well. I encourage you to talk to Jen while she's here. Incomes have doubled and tripled in these regions. The internal rate of return for those in economics is about 45% or more out of these systems. So it's been a real huge success that's being scaled up in West Africa now. On the management side, in our Mexico project, we've been doing a lot of work in just helping farmers manage nitrogen so that they don't lose so much. And you can obviously see the difference between using 300 kilograms of nitrogen versus using 0 kilograms of nitrogen. Well, our whole team has been working with farmers and giving them the diagnostic tools to do this. Also working with Chinese scientists, and Peter Vatusek and Pam Matson and others have been very active there. Increasing yields almost double in experiments in China without using any more fertilizer. So management has a lot of promise. There's a number of people in the Stanford community here working directly on policy issues, from the Farm Bill to U.S. policy to U.S. aquaculture issues, and abroad. Just 2 examples would be working on Indonesia's food and agricultural policies, on China's rural development and management policies. And so the last thing is consumption, which I'll end with. And we might say, well, let's just choose better food. And Therese Costello will help guide you through those decisions on the local food movement in her breakout session today. And it's really interesting how our choices can make a difference in the world, or can they? And that will be the real question. But I urge you, as you're thinking about this, we think about what's on our plate and in our kitchen, but I urge you to think globally, because it is Earth Day, and we want to think about the planet, not just the environmental resources, but the human society of the planet. And there's many people, for example, in Senegal, where they grow green beans for the market, in France, who are finally escaping some sort of poverty by being able to do this. And so these are tricky issues. And the challenges are enormous. I love this picture, but to me, it really illustrates the huge challenge that we have with the burgeoning, huge population and climate change and everything. So what does lie ahead? I mean, where are we going with this? I think the Stanford community really is at the leadership position of kind of an integrative, interdisciplinary approach of dealing with these issues. And a lot of innovation is taking place in a very promising way. So if you look closely at the picture, and particularly look at the trucks that are carrying this big load, I would say the good news is we're driving a Mercedes. And I'll leave you with that. Thank you. Yeah, so the question was, do we consider the population issue? That's actually why I ended with this picture, because the population issue is so huge. And in fact, Stanford, if we had had the Earth Day 20 or 30 years ago, would have been all about population. And I'm really surprised that fewer classes have been focused on population per se, and that's changing quite a bit. Population is huge. Obviously, it's the total mouths that you have to feed, and where those mouths are in countries that are also becoming richer, it just compounds the problem. So it's in terms of how we're thinking of it and how we're looking at the future, population is a huge issue. In our teaching and so forth, it's a big issue. In some of the research projects, it's a specific issue of what's going to happen. And we, in our project, for example, don't have any specific population policies or whatever, but I would say it was pretty bad form. This is a little bit of a political statement, so I'm sorry if I offend anybody, but a pretty bad form that all those budget discussions that we were having recently on the Hill dealt with Planned Parenthood and population and so forth, and didn't deal with our ethanol policy. Thank you.
Great. So our next speaker is Chris Field, Professor of Biology and Environmental Earth System Science. Chris is founding director of the Carnegie Institution's Department of Global Ecology. He is also the faculty director of the Jasper Ridge Biological Preserve. Chris is a specialist in global change research. His research program focuses on impacts of climate change, including its impacts on agriculture, and includes major field experiments on responses of California grasslands to multi-factor global change and integrative studies on the global carbon cycle. Chris will be speaking today about the food energy nexus.
Thanks, Stacy, and thanks everyone for joining in this Earth Day celebration. One of the things that I wanted to do in order to help celebrate Earth Day is give those of you who think that catching up on sleep deprivation is the way you'd like to celebrate by giving you my main points at the very first. The topic that I want to address concerns the big challenge of food production that Roz has already introduced, and to put it in the context of the climate problem and ask how much of the Earth's biological productivity, the source of food production, can we realistically move over to the energy sector? Roz already introduced the concept that 40% of the U.S. corn crop is used for biofuels already. And what I'd like to do is look back at the underlying physics and biology of how much biomass energy we really can bring into the energy system. And the bottom lines are the 4 points you see below. First, that there is a lot of biomass out there, and the biomass production is more than the annual global primary energy consumption, but it's not more by a huge demand, a huge multiple. The second thing, and kind of the key feature of the connecting the dots theme, is that there are multiple demands on lands that are producing food. They're also producing biological diversity. They're producing a range of ecosystem services that include clean air and clean water. And we need to be cognizant of the value that's provided by all of them. The way this shakes out is that biomass has the potential to be an important contributor to the energy sector, but it doesn't have the potential to be a dominant component. And we need to be really alert and sensitive to that as we think about policies and individual investments. And a final point that I'm going to leave you with is that the value of biomass depends strongly on how it's used, what kind of biomass it is, where it's grown, how it's produced, and how it's utilized. Our goal in this presentation is to figure out how we're going to provide energy in a way that doesn't produce unacceptable impacts on climate. So basically, we're talking about finding a way to use biomass energy to offset fossil emissions. We'd like to do it in a way that provides energy security and doesn't make the U.S. energy supply subject to political vagaries and unstable regions of the world. And ideally, we'd like to do this in a way that produced vibrant rural communities that aided local development around the world. But there are a number of things that we need to be very careful about avoiding as we try and solve this energy-climate connection. One thing is we want to develop biomass energy policies that avoid direct competition with food. Roz has already characterized the challenge of meeting the world food needs, and David Lobel is going to talk more about that. We also want to make sure that we don't deploy energy policies that have unacceptable impacts on biological diversity. It's easy to say that we have the physical potential to expand agricultural lands, but we do it at the peril of nature in many cases, and we want to be cognizant of that. At the same time, it's critical that we find a way to deploy energy technologies that avoid unacceptable impacts of climate change on food production, the topic that David is going to speak about. And we also want to make sure that as we think about utilizing biomass energy, we're doing it in a smart way, in a way that avoids unfavorable impacts on producing other kinds of energy. And we also want to make sure that we do it in a way that doesn't end up having impacts on climate that are the opposite of those we desire, that we make the climate change problem worse. And of course, we need to remember that we're doing this in a context with very dynamic social setting where we're looking at tremendous changes in the human drivers and feedbacks that include population, income, behavior, policy, and technology. So I want to ask 3 questions as we move forward. First, how much biomass can the world produce? How much of the biomass might we shift from the things it's doing now into the energy sector? and how important is the form of biomass energy in terms of the value that we derive from it. The size of the two symbols that you see here are indicative of the quantities. The red blob is the size of the global primary energy system. It was 469 times 10 to the 18th joules in 2009. And the size of the green blob is basically the energy content of all of the biomass that grows on an annual basis above ground on the world's land areas. And it's bigger than the primary energy blob, but it's bigger by between a factor of 3 and 4. If we think about having this primary productivity blob, the green blob, support all of the needs for food, all the needs for biological diversity, and all of the needs for other ecosystem services, it quickly becomes clear that we can't transfer anything approaching the 500 exajoules over to the energy system. I also want to position the magnitude of these two energy demands in the context of the solar energy that reaches the Earth's surface on an annual basis. The big yellow blob is the solar energy that reaches the Earth's surface on an annual basis. And the tiny little red one there is the size of the current global primary energy system. The size of the energy content of biomass is in the green blob. When we think about the big picture issue of how we're going to solve the energy challenge, it's incredibly attractive to look to that yellow blob. And even though there are opportunities in the green blob isn't where the action is. Okay, so how can we protect food and nature and avoid perverse effects on climate? There are at least 4 things we could do. We could focus on deriving biomass energy from lands that have been abandoned from agriculture. We could use agricultural waste and urban waste as a source of the biomass energy. We could use lands that are fundamentally unproductive, or we could go into areas where there are other ecological problems that we want to solve, for example, fire risk in forested areas. I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes about the opportunities for deriving biomass energy from the world's abandoned lands, because that's the one where I think the opportunities are most obvious, and it's the one that we've been best able to quantify in research at Stanford. First, let me set the scale. How much biomass does it take to provide energy services? You can feed a person, not well, but you can feed a person for about 250 kilograms of corn per year. With current technologies, we can make about enough ethanol from that much corn in order to provide one fill-up. If you think about how many vehicles we can run on the corn that's required to feed a community, if you think about a vehicle that gets 25 miles per gallon and drives 10,000 miles per year, what that means is that if you were to fuel that vehicle entirely on corn ethanol using current technology, you could feed about 20 people, and you'd require something like 1 hectare of the Earth's farmland. Currently, the Earth's total farmland area is about 1.5 billion hectares. Dan Sperling talks about us moving toward 2 billion vehicles, and so it's already clear that corn ethanol isn't going to be the route to powering all of those vehicles. So what we've tried to do in my research in collaboration with a number of people is to figure out how much land is available that's been used for farmland or pasture sometime in the past and is currently been abandoned either because it wasn't productive or because people want to do other things with it. And the areas are really substantial. We can use a number of biological and ecological approaches to figure out how much biomass could grow on that land. And so you can see the land area on the left-hand side and how productive it is on the right-hand side. And tremendous diversity in how productive the Earth's lands are. And there's a lot of interest in moving biomass energy into the unproductive lands, but then you get low levels of biomass energy out. The total amount of production on the Earth's croplands is between 6 and 7 billion tons of carbon per year. And on the pastures, it's around 11 billion tons. You can see in the right column. The world's abandoned lands probably produce around 2 billion tons of biomass per year. But some of that's in urban areas. Some of it's in forested areas where the biodiversity concerns probably trump the opportunities for biomass energy. And there's something like 400 to 500 million hectares, a big amount of land with a total production of maybe 1.5 to 2 billion tons. What's that mean in terms of the amount of energy that could be produced? If we could recover that energy with 100% efficiency, it might yield something like 30 to 40 exajoules, or 7 to 8% of the current global energy system. The bottom line here is that if we took all of the abandoned lands, could utilize all of the plants that grew on those with 100% efficiency, we would only meet 7 to 8% of the global primary energy demands with the current size of the energy system. Clearly, this is not a dominant component of where we need to go with energy supply. Roz already talked about emphasis on boosting productivity. Is that the answer? There are a lot of options we could take. We can use new technology in agriculture, fertilizer, irrigation, advanced crops, and algae, but there are limitations to each of these. Agricultural technology, basically without subsidies, we don't ever push agriculture above what nature does. With fertilizer, we know that it's energetically expensive to produce fertilizers, and you end up, unless you manage very carefully, with powerful greenhouse gases being released from the fertilization activities. Irrigation, similarly, is energetically expensive, and there are a tremendous number of competing demands on water. I think it's unlikely we're going to see a lot of irrigation supporting biomass agriculture. Can we do advanced crops? Things like miscanthus grow extremely well in the right places, but nature has spent hundreds of millions of years perfecting plants to grow in the climates where they do, and it's unlikely that without big subsidies in fertilizer and irrigation, we're going to see biomass agriculture exceed the levels that nature produces. And is the answer algae? Well, it's possible it is, but I think that algae is likely to be more of a niche application where we take advantage of the opportunity to solve problems, like the problem of the dead zone at the mouth of the Mississippi. The big problem with algae isn't the efficiency of the algae growth, it's rounding them up after they've been released to the environment. So finally, I just want to say a couple of things about how important the form of biomass energy is. And we should think about 3 issues here. How much fossil fuel does it require to get the biomass energy into a useful form? How much energy in carbon is released as we produce the biomass energy? And then how much services do we get from each unit? One way to measure this is we have decent numbers for the total amount of energy that we extract from a unit of biomass based on the amount of fossil energy that we put in. There's been a lot of research on corn ethanol indicating that it's relatively close to 1-to-1. You basically get 1 unit of ethanol energy out for every unit of fossil energy that you put in. Technology is improving, and in Nebraska now that number's up to about 2 to 3. In other settings, the numbers are higher, as high as 8 for soybean ethanol and maybe 9 for palm biodiesel and 5 for cellulosic ethanol. One of the things we want to make sure is that we don't use the dumb approaches to biomass energy and use pathways such that the energy that we extract is more or less the same amount of energy that we put in. A second critical concern is where do you get the biomass from? If you cut down a forest and release that forest carbon content to the atmosphere, you've got a huge carbon emission that you're trying to offset with the carbon gains from your biofuels crop. The analysis by Fargione and others indicates that it can take hundreds of years for the carbon offsets from the biofuels to make up for the carbon debt that's incurred by the deforestation that starts the whole process. And it's not just biofuels that go into areas as a result of direct deforestation that are a concern. We know that it's very difficult to displace crop production and convert it into bioenergy without having pressure to deforest in other parts of the world. This is a phenomenon called indirect deforestation. So the final topic I want to discuss very briefly is the question of, well, how much difference does it make to use the biomass energy in different forms? And in particular, I want to talk about the services we get from biomass energy. How much do you get from biomass used to produce electricity versus biomass used to produce transportation fuel as a liquid. And let's think about it in terms of transportation services per unit of land area. For the sake of this example, we'll use land area that's in corn. And in order to do this analysis, you want to go through the complete life cycle. How much energy is required to produce the fuel, how much is required to produce the vehicle, and how much to recycle the components of the vehicles. And the answer is that under current technologies, even with the vehicles we have now, it's much more efficient to think about a transportation system that runs on electricity with the biomass used to produce electricity rather than a transportation system that uses the biomass then going through a liquid fuel, going to an internal combustion engine. And even with the current technology, which is very limited, we get something like 81% more services, transportation per unit of land area, and 108% more greenhouse gas offsets per unit of land area. The economists sort of got it right in this cartoon where they said, in the past we were trying to figure out how to do light transportation from biomass energy, but now we've realized that for light transportation, the smart option is probably direct electrification, and what we should be focusing on with liquid transportation fuels are the hard problems like aircraft transportation. But finally, probably the toughest challenge we face now is the economics of the situation. And to quote Ross Perot, there's a giant sucking sound that's pulling biomass from corn toward offsetting crude oil, and not because that's the smart way to go in terms of the global system and global climate, but because corn at $252 a ton can offset crude oil at $752 a ton, and if it goes toward direct generation of electricity, it's mostly offsetting coal at $15 to $80 a ton. So finally, what do we know about the opportunity to use biomass energy to address climate problems without damaging food production? First, it's that there are really important constraints on the amount of land that's available, and we can't think about endlessly expanding the land area without incurring other big costs. The second is that the climate impact depends on the pre-existing ecosystem, whatever we start with, and if we make bad decisions about where we do biomass energy, we end up with bad outcomes. It's also important to remember that the paths to unfavorable outcomes aren't just the direct ones, and that even utilizing more of the existing U.S. corn crop for biomass energy likely results in an increase in deforestation rates in other parts of the world where farmers are making decisions about addressing issues with food demand. And finally, the form of the utilization of biomass energy matters greatly, and we want to make sure that when we decide to utilize biomass energy to offset climate impacts, we do it in a smart way. Finally, I want to thank the Stanford Global Climate and Energy Project, which is responsible for supporting a substantial amount of the research that you saw here. And thanks all of you very much.
Time for questions, if anybody has.
There are a number of research groups that have used a variety of historical, social, and economic records to estimate abandoned lands. And the reasons that lands have been abandoned historically vary a lot from region to region. In the U.S., there was a huge abandonment of agricultural land in the eastern half of the country once the railroad made it practical to transport agricultural products from the Midwest. In other countries, lands have been abandoned from agriculture because they were too degraded to produce or too salinized. And in still other countries, things like conflict have led to the abandonment of large amounts of productive land. Yeah, there are lots of opportunities for utilizing algae, particularly algae that grow in salt water. The big challenge with algae, I think, is going to continue to be infrastructure, the cost of creating the ponds, the cost of keeping the ponds from becoming too salty, the cost of rounding up the algae once you get them. And then it's also important to remember that one of the great things about higher plants, things like corn or trees, is that they pack a lot of energy into these big stems. Algae grow fast because they don't make big stems, but that also means that they don't end up with this densely packaged energy that's relatively free of the nutrients that make it so expensive to do the production. Algae has a lot of opportunities, but a lot of pitfalls. Okay, thanks very much.
I'd like to introduce our next speaker, David Lobel. David is Assistant Professor of Environmental Earth System Science and a Fellow in the Program on Food Security and the Environment. His research focuses on identifying opportunities to raise crop yields in major agricultural regions, with a particular emphasis on adaptation to climate change. In his talk today, David will address the question of how land can be used to simultaneously meet food, energy, and climate goals.
Okay. Thanks. So sitting here, I feel a little bit like we're kind of up here with a fire hose inundating you guys with information, and it's a little, even me who knows all this stuff already, is a little overwhelming. And there's a risk that you'll leave here feeling like these are interesting and huge problems, but almost intractable. And I just want to be clear that you shouldn't leave here thinking that. I think personally, and I think a lot of these speakers are quite optimistic about the fact that there are some good solutions out there, some good alternatives. And part of the point I think we're trying to make is that for every good solution or alternative, there's about 10 or 20 bad ones. And part of the idea is trying to be able to distinguish between those. And the other thing I think it's important to leave here is one of the things we want to do today is really showcase the students. And so I encourage you all to go to the breakout sessions. They're certainly a major part of why we feel like Stanford is a great center of work in this area. So I'm going to try to make 3 simple points in my however many minutes I have. One is an obvious one, but I don't want to assume that it's obvious to everyone, is that food and climate are tightly coupled, and it goes in both directions, and I'll explain what I mean by that. The second point is that, in a sense, if our goal is to try to decouple them, so in other words, to try to minimize the negative effects of climate on food or vice versa, there's a lot of ideas out there, and there's a lot of reasons that those ideas are just ideas and haven't been implemented. There's a lot of potential pitfalls, as I said, and I'll try to use an example to show some of that. And then the third is again to get at this how do you get traction on these things. I think that one thing that I've learned from doing research in this area and watching others, including many of the people here, is I've learned that it's really important to not talk in generalities. You want to talk in specifics. You want to talk in as quantitative terms as you can, and you want to be very careful that you're considering opportunity costs or alternatives. Or you don't want to just look at something like with or without, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Again, hopefully making it clear with an example. So I'm going to start where the same place Chris started. I figured with a connecting the dots, we had to have some dots being connected. So this is the same diagram Chris showed, and I'm going to really focus on the right-hand side here, which is the food versus climate, and it's I guess debatable what you would want to frame our goal as, but I don't think that's really the controversial part here. I think overall our goal is to try to, in a sense, let's see if this works. Wow, it's the fanciest thing I've ever done. So we want to, as much as we can, as I said before, I guess, reduce the negative impacts in both directions. And the reason these aren't, and the reason I keep saying that there's a lot of pitfalls, is these aren't easy, is one is that we understand these things are connected, but we really, in many cases, are just learning exactly how they're connected. So trying to quantify these connections can be quite difficult. Not only the direct connections, but also these indirect connections through things like food, through things like energy or water. The other really interesting and complicating matter is that humans are constantly responding to the environment. In general, this is through sort of our economic signals like prices, and there's a lot of things that aren't priced. But even just with the price signals, there's a lot of adaptive behavior that goes on, and ignoring that can lead you to some very erroneous conclusions. And then finally, as I said before, there's often a real failure to imagine what the world would look like if sort of a proposed idea actually takes place, and is it really a world that we want to live in? So let me use this example that Jen and I and others recently thought quite a bit about, which is you'll hear a number a lot that food contributes about 15% of greenhouse gas emissions, and the question is that really does that make sense? Is that a fair statement? Is it, because it sort of implies that let's just stop producing food and we'll have 15% less greenhouse gas emissions. Now that's silly on the face of it, but it's also deceptively attractive, I think, as an argument that people make. So it's certainly true that we use a lot of energy, as Chris sort of alluded to. We use a lot of energy in our food system already. We also use a lot of practices that produce greenhouse gases beyond just the energy use. And in fact, for agriculture, most of the greenhouse gas production is not just the energy use. So for example, on the left here, you see the fertilizer application in a typical field, a big tractor burning diesel. I think Wally was saying that last year, filling up a tractor in Iowa was about $1,000 charge. That's how much diesel they're using on in these operations. Once you apply the fertilizer, you get a lot of nitrous oxide production. There's ways to minimize that, but you still get some. There's a lot of pictures not shown here, things with methane production and so forth. So it is true that we do have a very energy intensive and a very greenhouse intensive practice. This is just a classic summary of it, showing you for the recent past what the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions of humanity is. So we're up about, well, actually above this now, about 50 gigatons of CO2. And a sizable chunk of that is related to non-CO2 gases, and most of those are from agriculture. So if you sum up all of agriculture's contributions, you get something like 15%. So you'll hear a lot of people saying we're just basically turning fossil energy into food energy, and what we need to do is go back to less fossil intensive approaches. And this got Jen and I thinking, is that really true? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But the key is you have to think about what's the alternative. Is it an organic type of production system where you're using manure, and is there enough manure to do that? Are you talking about just having local food? And Therese, as Roz mentioned, Therese will be having a discussion of more broadly of local food, but here we're just talking in terms of greenhouse gases. Or is it, a lot of times people will come up with these traditional approaches that have been used for thousands of years and really are the way to move forward. So for simplicity, let's just consider one of these here, which is what would have happened if we just stopped intensifying at 1960. We just sort of kept it at that sort of somewhat intensified but moderate level of intensity. And again, a lot of people would feel like the Green Revolution did a lot to negatively impact the climate system. And the first reaction, I think, to this kind of question is one that was raised before, which is that, well, and one that I used to think is that if we didn't have so much food, we wouldn't have so much people, so all the problems in the world would be smaller. That's again, like I said, I used to think that, and I think of myself as a fairly smart person, but it's not. It's surprisingly not the case. And what this shows is this is a plot I made with this cool software that many of you might know about, this Gapminder software. And on the x-axis here is the mortality rate across different countries. So each of these light circles is a different country in 2009. The size of the country being a bigger country. So this would be China, for example. And on the y-axis here is the fertility rate of women. So what this says is that as you live in societies where you have a high risk of your child dying, you, and I'm embellishing here, but there are studies to back this story up, your response to that risk basically is to have more children. And you see a very clear negative correlation as you, again, this is not shown so clearly here, but you'll have to trust me. What happens first is mortality rates go down, but soon after that, fertility rates go down even faster. So what's shown here is just a trajectory from 1960 or 1950 actually, to 2009 for what happened in India, which is one of the key places of the Green Revolution, and also in Kenya, which to a lesser degree has intensified. And you can see that mortality rates have gone down and fertility rates have gone down quite a bit. And for those of you who were hopefully taking my advice at the beginning of being real quantitative, you should be looking on these axes now and figuring out, well, which has gone down faster? Is it the mortality rate or fertility rate? But to save you the computation, here's the population growth now plotted against mortality rate. And so, for example, in India, again, initially what happened with the decrease in mortality rates, this was largely due to reduced poverty from more food, also health advances, but I think health advances and food security are going hand in hand in a lot of these countries, is you do have a slight increase in population growth at first, but then the response, and any of us would respond the same way, the response is to quickly not have so many kids, and the total population growth is actually declining in India. Now, there are country-to-country variations, but the global trend is very similar. And interestingly, if you try to look at fixing 1960 fertility rates and mortality rates and project them forwards, we would still have about 7 billion people today. So we would have a world with a lot more death and a lot more starvation, but not necessarily less people. 5 minutes left, okay. So let me cut this story a little bit short, which is that we can look at now these different scenarios of if you had the same number of people, even if they were poorer and eating less, you would have to provide that food somehow. And if you didn't have new technologies, if you hadn't intensified, you would have to meet it with new lands. If you met it with new lands, as was mentioned previously, you have to displace something, and that displacement is often almost universally, but especially in some ecosystems, associated with a very large flux of carbon. The question then becomes, is that flux of carbon large enough to balance the reduction in the sort of nitrous oxide, methane type emissions that we associate with intensification? And the answer is that it's more than enough to compensate for that. Just showing you quickly here, this is sort of our scenario of what actually happened in terms of total greenhouse gas emissions associated with nitrous oxide production, which are shown in the blue here, the production of fertilizer, which is an energy-intensive process, the methane production from rice, and land conversion, which has been declining through time because we've been expanding less and less land. If you go over here, for example, to one of our alternate worlds where we had the fertility, mortality, and living standards fixed at 1961 levels, you do have a reduction in emissions from the agricultural lands themselves, but you have then this expansion which produces much more carbon. And the bottom line of this is that we've actually had much lower emissions than if we had resorted to those low intensity approaches for the reasons I list here. And what's interesting about this study to me most is that the amount of money we've invested in intensification was actually a pretty good bargain in terms of the carbon savings. If you work out, it's about $10 a ton per CO2, which is really competitive with most mitigation scenarios. So I would argue, for example, moving forward, agriculture deserves a lot of the attention for trying to mitigate future climate change. So I don't have too much time, but I wanted to also talk about the other direction a little bit. This is something I work quite a bit on. What do we know about this? Well, we know one thing for sure, which is that climate is important for food. And you can see that just by looking at where people grow food. This is a map just showing the percent of cropland. We tend to grow it where soils are good and climates are favorable, not in the desert, not in the tundra. Beyond that, we don't know as much as we'd like. One key question is really, given where they're grown now, what happens as you start to change the temperatures, as you start to change the rainfall? And again, this is an empirical question, and we've gone in a lot of studies and tried to measure this. This is showing one in Africa where we've teamed up with local scientists who have a lot of field trials, in this case 20,000 or more field trials. And you can see when you go through the process of getting all this data together, there's quite a clear relationship with temperature. There's a lot of other factors in play, but you can get a very clear signal of temperature's importance, and it's actually quite important. About a day spent above 30 degrees Celsius, which is about 86 Fahrenheit, or exactly 86 Fahrenheit, you actually, for each day you spend at that temperature, you'll expect 1% less in yields. Let me make one final point, and this is just to get you thinking about climate change, not so much as something in the future. We've tended, I think, to think about it not only as something in the future, but as something other countries worry about. And I think what we're learning increasingly is that this is something that's here with us now, and it's already affecting the system. And I'm just showing you here from a paper we just wrote that you can look at temperature trends in the times of year where crops are growing and in the places where they're growing over the last 30 years. And you can look at how much that's been changing relative to how much change they're used to having year-to-year variations. So for example, in this top plot where you see a number of 2, that means that the trend in temperature over this time was actually about 2 standard deviations of the historical variability. So in other words, their current temperatures now are already at the tail of, or at the extreme of what they would have expected back in 1980. And these, even to somebody who studies this a lot like me, this was surprisingly big, because here we are sitting in the United States. We don't read many news stories about this. If anything, we read news stories about how farmers don't believe climate change is happening. And it's true in the United States, actually, but it's not true almost everywhere else. The other interesting thing is about precipitation, but since I don't have time, I'll just say that not a whole lot's changing there, which is a surprise to some people. Getting back finally, as like Chris, I'll say finally 5 times. Finally, the big remaining question is, sorry, Chris, is how are people responding? And the truth is here that there's a lot of theory. There's a lot of reasons people should respond. There's also a lot of reasons that people won't respond or can't respond. They're constrained in some way. And this, again, is what I would view as a very empirical question that one benefit of the previous slide of having seen all of this change already is that we should be able, in the next 5 or 10 years, to gain some traction on understanding how do systems really respond and how can we best facilitate that response. And with that, I'll cut it off. Thanks. Yeah, so there are definitely products of agriculture that are healthy and products of agriculture that are not healthy. I'm not sure I would say that the intensification was in order to generate high fructose corn syrup. I think that was a product that was almost sort of created out of the surplus of corn that we had. You know, I think we could go into the U.S. Story specifically, and the reason that we had the policies that we did in response to periods of past shortfalls. But I think as you look around the world, if you were to look at India, you look at China, and all of these different, in each of these cases, things have been intensifying. So it's not a U.S. only story. It's not a story only of, say, private sector investment. I think throughout the world, what we've seen is a general intensification of agriculture, which in the most cases are meeting basic human needs. But certainly, the price of food declining has led to greater meat demand, greater use of corn syrup, and health impacts. And it's part of the reason we want to have these conversations is to think through those things a little bit more. But I would not think of the correlation between intensification and corn syrup as being one cause the other. I mean, there certainly is a lot of thought to what drives these intensifications, what drives these technology development. And you generally have either land-saving technologies or labor-saving technologies. And in the U.S., for example, we've seen labor-saving technologies where we have huge amounts of land now managed by basically one farmer in a tractor. There are trade-offs with all these decisions. I think that what we've seen, the pattern throughout history, at least as I understand it, is that people would rather not do the backbreaking work of agriculture. They would rather have an easier life, and that's not a statement that applies to everyone. But historically, we've had those other opportunities to pull people away from agriculture. In some of the poorest places of the world, for example, we talk a lot about Africa, and we have a policy series about Africa. Right now, I think one of the big questions in Africa is what are the opportunities outside of agriculture to, in a sense, absorb some of that labor from agriculture if they do want to move to some of these in sort of labor or land-saving technologies. It's an interesting process, what we call structural transformation of a society as they go through from a very agrarian to a very non-agrarian. And historically, that's just been the way that everybody's gone. It hasn't been forced upon them in any way. It's just sort of the natural course of human preference, I guess. Well, so let me just be clear that we're not defending all aspects of intensification. There are definitely ways to intensify smart and dumb. For example, you don't want to plant every square inch of your land with the same exact variety, the same exact crop, because that can really lead to pest and weed issues. I would challenge the notion that, again, like at the global scale, that intensification leads to a loss of biodiversity because you are sparing, Pam hates this phrase, but you're sparing some land for biodiversity. I think the key is to really think not only about sort of what's happening in a particular part of the world, but what's happening globally. And I guess you could think of that at different scales also. But it's really unclear whether we would be better off in terms of biodiversity if we had, and there are studies of this, but there are not that many, and it's very empirically unclear. So but that's a good topic maybe for the panel to talk about. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Buzz Thompson, the Robert E. Paradise Professor in Natural Resources Law, as well as Director of the Woods Institute for the Environment. Buzz has contributed a large body of scholarship on environmental and resource issues, ranging from sustainable water management to the use of economic techniques to improve environmental performance. Buzz will discuss the food-water nexus today, talking about how water policies affect the sustainability of agriculture around the globe.
So it's a true pleasure and also great fun so far to have an opportunity to be here today and to explore these connections between the work that all of us are doing. As you probably all know, we're actually in the 7th year now of the Stanford Initiative on Environmental Sustainability, which is trying to build these connections on a daily basis. And yet one of the things that I find is you get so absorbed in your work that it's a real opportunity to be able to take a step back sometimes and hear what other people are doing in very similar areas. So I have 3 basic messages today with respect to the food-water nexus. The first is that food production is clearly related to the water problems that we're facing globally today. Second of all, that those water problems are very serious. And third of all, that there are solutions to those problems, but we have to be very careful in the way in which we craft those solutions. So first of all, the relationship between food production on the one hand and the water problems on the other. Food has at least 2 impacts on our water problems. First of all, agriculture can directly impact supply. So 150 years ago, a lot of people thought that the rain followed the plow. And they were wrong about that. But today, in some areas, the exact opposite might actually be the case. So we're facing deforestation in many areas of the world. And the studies suggest that in many of those areas, the deforestation is affecting precipitation. So this particular picture shows deforestation in the Amazon region as a result primarily of expansion of ranch lands, but also some farming operations. And studies suggest that if deforestation in the Amazon continues at its current trajectory, that by late in this particular century, precipitation in the Amazon on average may drop by something in the nature of 25%. It would vary depending on the particular area of the Amazon, with maybe even more precipitation in the upper regions of the Amazon, but much less in the lower regions of the Amazon. Evapotranspiration would also decrease because of the loss of the forest area, but the loss in precipitation, or the drop in precipitation, would be twice what the loss in evapotranspiration would be. Furthermore, there have been studies, in particular out of Duke University, that suggest that as the loss of the Amazon rainforest continued, you would also see reduced rainfall in areas as remote as the Gulf of Mexico, Texaco, and Texas and northern. Yeah, Texaco is actually it's the right place, and northern Mexico in the crucial spring and summer months. The other way in which agriculture affects water is as the largest consumer of water supply. So ag worldwide consumes, well, it actually withdraws about 2/3 of all the water we withdraw from our rivers, and it actually consumes a higher percentage of that. To the degree that ag grows, it tends to squeeze out the environment today. But of course, ag is in competition with domestic and industrial use, and as our urban areas grow, they also put an additional squeeze on agriculture. So you see this competition developing between these various uses of water resources today. And it isn't simply because agriculture wastes water. Agriculture just needs a lot of water. So probably most of you are familiar with the large amount of water that it requires to produce one cow. But if you take a third pound of beef hamburger, it requires about 650 gallons of water to produce that particular hamburger. Two things that I find even more amazing is that if you have a glass of wine, like this particular glass of wine, it takes 1,000 cups of water to produce that glass of wine. And maybe even more consternating, if you have a cup of water, it actually requires 1,200 cups of water in order to produce your 1 cup of coffee. Now, it is still better if you're trying to reduce your water footprint to be a vegetarian than to be a meat consumer. As a general matter, vegetable proteins take something in the nature of about 1/3 to maybe about 1/10 as much water as meat proteins. But nonetheless, all agriculture requires significant amount of water. Now, agriculture has been becoming more efficient. I mean, historically, a lot of our agricultural fields look like this particular picture where we were involved in massive flood irrigation, where the crops only consumed a little bit of that water, the rest of that water was, quote, wasted. Today, we're finding increasingly around the world that agriculture is switching to sprinkler systems, like you see in this particular picture, or drip irrigation. That increases our water productivity. In other words, we're actually able to produce more in the way of food for a given use of water, but this is not necessarily better for the environment. Before, when we were using the flood irrigation, most of that water that was, quote, wasted would run back into the river or to an underground aquifer and be reutilized. Today, as we're becoming more efficient with our water, we also tend to get more intensive with our agricultural production. And there are many areas of the world that, as a result of actually switching to sprinklers or to drip irrigation, actually end up consuming a higher percentage of the water in the river and depleting the downstream flow of those waterways. In addition to simply taking a lot of water out of our rivers, we've also engaged in significant hydrologic modification. This is a picture of one of the facilities of the Central Valley Project here in California, which takes water from the Sierra and then moves it out into the Central Valley for use of farmers in that area. But we also take water from the Colorado River, move it into the Coachella and Imperial Valleys. And not only the taking the water out of the river, but simply the facilities themselves pose a significant risk to the environment. So what are some of the problems that that water consumption is posing? One is disappearing rivers, lakes, and deltas. This particular picture shows 3 shots of the Aral Sea, 1977, 1989, and 2006. The Aral Sea was once one of the 4 largest lakes in the world. That was until the 1960s when the Soviet Union decided to take the 2 major rivers that fed the Aral Sea and divert those to irrigate the growing of rice, melons, cereal, and cotton in areas that otherwise would not have been able to grow those particular crops. Sounds actually very similar to California in the last century. But as a result of diverting those waters from the feeder rivers, as you can see from this particular picture, the Aral Sea began to shrink until today it is only about 10% of its historic size. Leading both to the decimation of the fishery, which used to be the major commercial use of the Aral Sea, and also potentially leading to significant climate impacts in the area of the Aral Sea. One of the things that's interesting about this is people knew this was going to happen. The Soviet engineers of Politburo knew that as a result of that irrigation operation this would happen to the Aral Sea, but the notion was that it was worth it to grow the food, a decision which is being reconsidered today. In addition to the loss of major rivers, deltas, and lakes, we are also seeing a significant decline in freshwater fish as a result of both taking the water out of the waterways and also the hydrologic modifications. I just finished a book on California water with a variety of people, including Peter Moyle, who's a fish biologist at UC Davis. And one of the things that we found in that particular book is that if you look at the freshwater fish species that are extant for California, that were native to California, 7% of those are now extinct. 31% of those are listed under the state or federal Endangered Species Act. Another 69% are considered fish of special concern, which means they probably should be listed. Only 22% of our native freshwater fish species are considered to be relatively stable today. Peter also believes that if you look globally, about 30 to 50% of all freshwater fish species are in serious trouble because of the amount of water that we're taking out of our rivers, largely for agriculture and because of hydrologic modification. And about 4,000 to 7,000 fish species are likely to go extinct within the next 50 years unless we reverse that particular trend. Another thing which Roz mentioned earlier is that as a result of agricultural operations, we're also putting a lot more in the way of nutrients, nitrogen, and phosphorus into our waters. In fact, the flux of reactive nitrogen increased between 1860 and 1990 by about 80%. This is leading to a variety of problems, but particular in the coastal areas off the deltas of these particular rivers. It's leading to eutrophication, where we have a reduction in oxygen supply, and as a result, a reduction in the carrying capacity of fish in that particular area. This is a picture of the dead zone off the coast of Louisiana. And the Mississippi River. This particular dead zone varies from year to year, but on average it's about 8,000 square miles, the size of New Jersey, and recognize that a study 2 years ago found that this is one of only 400 dead zones that are now found worldwide. In addition to that, a lot of farming is not from water in rivers, but it's from water that we take out of the ground. And as we take water out of the ground, what happens is our groundwater tables fall. That leads to increased energy costs for getting that water out of the ground. For example, in India, over the past 10 years, the cost of getting water out of the ground has doubled as a result of the falling water tables. It also uses up water that would not be available anymore in the future. It can also lead to subsidence. The picture on the right is one of my favorite pictures. This shows subsidence in the Central Valley of California as a result of agricultural operations there. The gentleman there is standing next to a telephone pole, as you can see, in 1977. And up at the very top, you see the number 1925. That was where the surface of that area of the San Joaquin Valley was in 1925. So you see the amount of subsidence that has occurred as a result of that groundwater use. In addition to that, as we take out groundwater, it can also affect groundwater-dependent ecosystems. This is the Cosumnes River in the Sierra area. This used to be a river which ran year-round. It was a gaining river. Groundwater actually fed the river. As a result of depletions of groundwater in the area by agriculture, what we are now finding is that it is a losing river year-round. As you can see in this particular picture, it doesn't flow for much of the year. Another thing that people probably frequently don't think about is the interrelationship between food, taking the groundwater, and the groundwater depletion then leading to sea level rise. There was a recent study that suggests that probably about 25% of sea level rise in recent years has been the result of groundwater depletion, because you're basically taking the water out of the ground, and you then are adding that into the atmospheric system, which actually increases the amount of water in the oceans. So those are the problems, but there are also solutions. So one solution is water conservation. There are a variety of techniques, leveling of the grounds, the sprinkler and drip irrigation systems I showed earlier, that will help us in reducing the amount of water that we are using in agriculture. One of the things that we have to keep in mind, though, when we're looking at water conservation is where was the water that we are now conserving? Where did that water used to go? Right? I told you the story a moment ago of switching from flood irrigation to drip irrigation. That's conservation, but that water used to be reutilized. And frequently we are finding that in areas where there is an opportunity to conserve more water, the water that is right now being considered wasted is actually going into aquifers or going back into the river and reutilized. And so to the degree that we go in there and try and conserve that water, that is frequently taking water away from other existing uses. So although there's a lot of opportunity here, we have to be very careful about the way in which we do it. One way in which we can encourage agriculture to conserve is to encourage water transfers. Water transfers are where one user can pay another user to conserve and then transfer that water. There's actually a lot of agriculture to agriculture water transfers taking place today, where one sector of agriculture pays another area to conserve water so that the first area can enjoy more water. As urban areas grow, we're also now seeing a rise in agriculture to urban water transfers. The largest one in the state of California is from the Imperial Irrigation District, which you see in the upper right-hand corner, which is found in sort of the lower eastern corner of the state of California, to San Diego, which you see in the picture on the upper right-hand corner. These are far more controversial because the communities from which the water is being taken are frequently worried about what the impact of that diversion of water from their community to another community is going to have on their economic future. Another possibility is water recycling and reuse. So this is a picture of the Monterey area, which has the advantage of being right next to a lot of agricultural fields, and is now the site of the largest urban to ag water recycling operation. So the wastewater of Monterey is being recycled and then utilized in the fields of the Salinas Valley. This has the advantage, though, of having the city right next to the agricultural area. The other thing that a lot of areas are now looking at is, could you, for example, take the wastewater of San Francisco, move that to, for example, agricultural operations in the Central Valley in return for having some of the water of the Central Valley used in San Francisco. This is something that San Francisco has actually looked at. The problem, of course, is the cost of transporting that water those significant distances. And then the final potential solution is that rather than trying to grow crops in water scarce regions, you import crops from water-rich regions. This is a strategy, for example, that Jordan has adopted in recent years, with the notion that if you have scarce water, why spend it necessarily on agriculture? You can import your food, and then you have that water available for other potential uses. And this brings up the concept of virtual water that Roz mentioned earlier. And in fact, we have for many years seen water moving from one nation to another nation in the form of food. And if you actually look, for example, at the amount of water which is used in various countries, the first column shows the amount of water which is consumed by agriculture for domestic production in these various countries. The second shows the amount of virtual water that they're using. So for example, again, take the case of Jordan. Jordan only consumes 21 gigacubic meters per year of water for their domestic crops, but recognize that they have almost 4 times that amount of water that they're utilizing in the form of virtual water in the crops that they have. The United States is exactly the opposite situation. Now, it turns out if you look at this, there's virtually no correlation between who's a net importer and exporter of virtual water and how water scarce they are. As a general matter, other issues are actually driving whether or not an area is a net importer or exporter of water. But more and more countries are beginning to think about whether or not, rather than using their own water, they should be importing the virtual water. And this also raises one final concern, which is, do we have a potential concern of leakage here? So this is a picture of where there is groundwater depletion worldwide. We need to solve this problem, as we talked about earlier. But one of the questions is, to the degree that one country solves its water problems by, for example, no longer mining its groundwater, will that simply push the problem to a neighboring country? And if so, then by solving the problems locally, we sometimes lose some of the value of that because, again, we're simply displacing the problem to another area. So again, ag influences water. The problems are severe. There are solutions, but we have to be very careful and thoughtful in the way in which we actually implement those solutions. So thank you very much. Okay, so several things. So the question is, how is the increased production of natural gas, particularly by new various techniques, impacting water, and how should EPA respond to it? The major impact is water quality, as you suggested earlier, because typically what they are doing is they are pumping the water out as part of their operations, and then the easiest thing to do with that water is simply dump it into the rivers and streams, and that causes significant water quality problems. EPA is actually looking at this issue right now. The Science Advisory Board for EPA has a major study of it, and my guess is within the next year or two, you will see EPA beginning to think about what regulatory measures to take in response. There's also possibly a water quantity issue. I'm actually special master in a case right now between Montana and Wyoming. And Montana actually believes Wyoming's energy operations right now are depleting the waters of the Yellowstone River, not because of directly taking the water out, but because of their pumping operations nearby. But we don't know. I mean, that would be a factual question. So the answer I would have to that question is that I think inevitably you need local solutions, and that's for several reasons, one of which is that the local problems are always quite unique, and so it's very difficult to have a one-size-fits-all solution that is implemented from the top, but that frequently the local institutions won't do anything unless there is state or national pressure. And so I think we need in the water area something very similar to what we adopted to promote clean air and clean water in the 1970s. A cooperative federalism approach where the national government or the state government says this is the way in which you need to manage your groundwater, or this is the way in which you need to manage a watershed. These are the basic standards. We don't care how you actually achieve those standards so long as you achieve them. And that means you would then have the national and the state setting the goals, but then you would have local implementation. I think that type of a system is the direction that we need to head, and more people are talking about that type of an approach. So again, thank you very much.
Okay, our final speaker in this session is Tino Cuellar, professor of law at Stanford Law School. Tino is also a faculty member in the Center for International Security and Cooperation at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Tino works at the intersection of law, public policy, and political science. His research and teaching focus on administrative law, executive power, and how organizations implement critical regulatory, public safety, and international security responsibilities in a changing world. Tino will talk today about the food security nexus, discussing the importance of understanding the connections between food security, institutions, and the broader international security environment.
Good afternoon, and thank you for being so attentive and engaged. And thank you also really for voting with your feet. We put these things together in part because we want to learn how the different pieces of the puzzle fit together, and you and your participation and your being here makes a big difference. I started walking my daughter to school this morning, and she asked me how I was going to celebrate Earth Day, which, given that she's 6 years old, indicates that the whole idea of Earth Day has really penetrated pretty profoundly. And I said I would celebrate to her by speaking about connecting the dots. She looked at me confused and said, I didn't know you were an expert in connecting the dots. I thought you were a lawyer. So you might also think that I'm a little bit coming out of left field here with a somewhat different perspective, but I think you'll also see there's some connections. I want to talk to you about how food is a security issue. And I'll say more in a moment about how I'm defining security. But my goal here is helping you understand how what happens with food and what happens with people's access to food around the world can affect questions of war and peace and the foreign policy interests of the United States. But I also want to talk a little bit about the global food system as a system, a mechanism of laws, of economic relations that affect people's lives and that sometimes is not organized to take into account the security dimensions. Third, I want to underscore how much that global food system is affected by what happens in this very country, in your country, the United States of America. And finally, I want to suggest to you that the reasons that we ought to be concerned about these issues right now is because gathering pressures are developing that could potentially move things in a rather different direction. So let me start by saying that I'm a recovering public official. I was in government up until fairly recently. And nonetheless, despite my experience, I believe that sometimes public officials actually have reasonably smart things to say. Let me point, for example, to an observation that Kofi Annan has made, an observation that Hillary Clinton made. And what I want to underscore here is the gap, to some degree, between the way they are thinking about global security and foreign policy issues and the way many scholars occasionally attack these questions. Scholars often begin from the presumption that you can best understand foreign policy by thinking about countries and what they do. And what Kofi Annan and Hillary Clinton are reminding us of is that the world is actually driven by organizations, by sub-state actors, by criminal entities, by corporations. Sometimes these are actually quite different. But also by you, by people who are the public in advanced industrialized countries who, in a very real sense, set the global agenda by the demands that you make on your governments. And this then leads me to think a little bit about the connections between all these organizations and sub-state actors and domestic publics and food and security. From a conceptual perspective, you could say that there are a couple of different ways in which food affects security. Let's start with the concept of human security, which is unheard of 60 or 70 years ago, but is now much more accepted even in international law to some degree. That's the idea that we ought to think about security not only as a question of whether people are going to die because somebody shoots a gun at them, but we also ought to think about massive, sudden, profound discontinuities in social well-being, whether they come from disease, from a lack of access to food, or from regime instability. And these things are important. So from the perspective of human security, food security is a security problem. But second, you could say that there's some developing empirical evidence of the extent to which conflict disrupts access to food. So countries that have relatively robust systems that allow them to feed people are less able to do that when a civil war breaks out. That's one reason to think about the connection of security and food. I'm particularly interested in the extent to which disruptions in food can create regime instability. There's only now beginning to be some good quantitative work on this. But I'll also underscore that there is some longer-term work that's been done in sociology showing how countries that develop a capacity for domestic use of the military can use that capacity as a substitute for simply meeting the nutritional needs of people, so that you see that countries that are better able to deploy their military domestically and to clamp down on dissent that way become more prone to famines and problems involving feeding the public. Let's put the issue of hunger, the human security issue, in the context of broader questions of conflict. And you can see here, just quite simply, that hunger kills a heck of a lot of people. Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression for a moment that the right way to think about terrorism, for example, is simply to look at the number of people who die in a given year and say, well, because only a few thousand people die, it's not a problem. I, for one, believe that terrorism is a concern because it affects norms. Think about what happens to reporters when a number of them die because of terrorist attacks. But all of that said, and underscoring also the importance of conflicts that kill people through deaths in battle, civilians that die directly because of conflict, civilians that die indirectly from conflict, you're really talking about a very different scale of problem when you're talking about hunger and malnutrition. That's one important takeaway from here. The other important takeaway, which Roz alluded to at the beginning, is simply that we're actually doing worse in terms of feeding the world. And that, according to a great many people who are very thoughtful about these issues, doesn't have so much to do with our capacity to grow food, at least at this point, and leaving aside the many consequences from environmental nature that you've heard more about today, but it has a lot to do with how the world is organized, how people are actually fed, what governments do. And what's worrisome here, of course, is that a number of different factors, technologically and otherwise, have led to declining trend in malnourishment over many decades, but that trend is now being reversed, and it's having an impact around the world. Some of that impact is felt because of the particular features that create what you could call a global food system. This is a very complicated topic. It implicates trade, development, governance, domestic policy. But I just want to highlight a couple of key points here that I think are very interesting to think about. Let me start by just briefly citing something that will seem completely disconnected, which is a case I talked about in my administrative law class about 4 days ago. This is a case of Murray versus United States Department of Agriculture. And it's a case involving a household of about 13 people who heavily depended on food stamps in the 1970s. The case goes all the way on the Supreme Court because this family was completely eliminated from access to food stamps because of a very small technical error in their application for food stamps. And the Supreme Court concludes as a matter basically of constitutional law that they ought to have a chance to plead their case to the Department of Agriculture before they're completely eliminated on the technicality. And the Supreme Court has this language in there that is maybe not quite poetic, but prosaic, discussing the extraordinary importance of the food safety net. Talks about how the country is what it is in part because of the food stamp system and the profound impact on society and on families of people are excluded. That underscores the point that advanced industrialized countries come to the global food system with a massive advantage. They've had the organizational capacity, the economic capacity to develop a robust safety net, one that has not perhaps completely eliminated hunger as a problem in the advanced industrialized world, but has dramatically decreased its size. As a result, if these countries have solved their domestic food insecurity problems, their political incentives are really quite different. They care differently about fluctuations in food prices. They're much more willing to press the rest of the world towards a very integrated system where food flows across borders and where countries are in a globally integrated market, but where low-income countries, developing countries, face some substantial challenges when food prices spike. Add to this, of course, that advanced industrialized countries have sometimes been enormously successful at maintaining domestic agricultural subsidies and doing a number of other things that we could talk about that have an effect on developing countries. But a key point is that the whole world doesn't look this way. Certain emerging powers, places like China and India, have a different take on things. And as their power grows, the world will begin to understand that one key difference between them and the advanced industrialized world as it stands right now is that places like China and India have not entirely solved their domestic food insecurity problems. So these are countries that might have a different take on how well the global food system works. The elephant in the room has an American flag on it. And this is my way of telling you that my reference to advanced industrialized countries includes many countries, but the U.S. is especially important in the global food system. Following World War II, 3 things made the U.S. particularly prominent as an actor in the global food system. Number 1, the U.S. was the most prominent economy in the world. Second, it was also an agricultural powerhouse, so many of its incentives reflected the fact that it had a big domestic agricultural sector. Number 3, the U.S. was the global agenda setter with respect to security and foreign policy issues. And that underscores the extent to which even today the U.S. has an outsized role in shaping the global food system. This is just one example of that. Over 50% of all the global food aid in the world basically comes from the U.S. But that is just one dimension of how much the U.S. affects the global food system. The reality is that the U.S. comes to these issues with, to some degree, humanitarian concern, but also with a variety of domestic political constraints. So if you look at the fine print of our food aid, and this is something Roz knows very well and has talked about extensively, you have a system that's designed to serve domestic constituencies in a very important way. So a substantial amount of U.S. food aid has to go through Great Lakes ports, and this is something I talked about in Chicago, and I almost felt like I needed to have some bodyguards there. And in a variety of other ways, the U.S. food aid system is designed in a fairly inefficient way. I could say a lot about U.S. agricultural subsidies. Even after some important reforms in the 1990s, the U.S. still engages in a substantial degree of subsidies to its agricultural sector, which affects the capacity of a lot of developing countries to compete. And of course, we've talked about biofuels and the implications of biofuels for global food markets. But I want to underscore also the extent to which the U.S. as a government is organized in a way that doesn't encourage people to connect the dots, to do what you're doing right here. The executive branch, for example, includes a national security staff that works for the president and helps the president respond to foreign policy and national security needs. That national security staff has never included representatives of agencies that are engaged in food issues. The Agriculture Secretary is not a member of the National Security Council. The structure of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, I would argue, plays down the connection between security and domestic agriculture. And even the Energy Department structure doesn't have someone there that has as a portfolio, as a job, to think about the extent to which U.S. biofuels policy affects the international food system and its consequences for U.S. security. That organizational fragmentation doesn't just live in the executive branch. It also lives in the U.S. Congress. The U.S. Congress has agriculture committees in the Senate and the House that are composed of what political scientists would call preference outliers, people who have particular points of view because they come from particular states. And that doesn't encourage a connection among these different issues. I would say that one irony is that many advanced industrialized countries justify their agricultural subsidies on the basis of a security argument, without considering potentially the security consequences of the global food system as it currently stands. To sum up, I think it's very important for us to realize that this is a dynamic system and it's in flux. Nothing is set in stone. I think it's very important for our research here at Stanford, and this is something I'm working on with colleagues, to understand domestic precedents and pressures that can give us some sense of how domestic issues with international implications have evolved in the U.S. How, for example, we addressed the civil rights challenges that face this country for many, many, many decades, to some degree still face us, but that at the time when they became a huge, massive national issue in the 50s and 60s, were having international implications in how the U.S. was seen. I've done a lot of work on how changes in the structure of U.S. government can affect policymaking. This is an area where we need to look at the consequences of reforms and restructuring of government very seriously. Certainly, we need to keep an eye on how developing climate change changes affect migration patterns, border disputes, access to food, and other issues that affect U.S. security. And last, and certainly not least, unlike the U.S. and Europe, Brazil, India, and China face these chronic food insecurity challenges to differing degrees and in different ways, but certainly in ways that make them have a different perspective on the politics of food. Thank you very much. I think it's very hard. I think you can find more than a few people in government who are absolutely willing to think hard about these issues and to take a step back. Some of them are at places like USAID. But the challenge is matching the people who are willing to take the big picture perspective with the jurisdiction of their agencies and the incentives that they respond to. So I would start by noting three things. Number one, some of this does involve the executive branch and requires leadership. I would think about changing the relationship between the National Security Council, the Agriculture Department, USAID, the Domestic Policy Council. I'd create some kind of interagency process with a specific mandate to think about the connection of U.S. domestic agricultural policy and our foreign policy interests. Second, I think it's important to realize that some of this does go back to Congress, and I would look at the extent to which other congressional committees besides the agriculture committees, maybe the foreign policy committees, might get into this area and share jurisdiction with the agriculture committees. And last but certainly not least, I think there's a special place to be filled by organizations like Stanford and like civil society groups that can provide a room for track two discussions, quiet, off-the-record discussions where people from government come together outside of the interagency process to think about how to do things differently. Yep, sure. So this is an area that I'm thinking about with some other folks, and I would just start by noting that if a country is going to participate in a global food system that involves big spikes in prices, big changes from one year to the next, they might have a different willingness to accept those fluctuations depending on how much of a social insurance system they have domestically that will insulate their population from those shifts in prices, and therefore will translate to greater political stability internally. But if they have a big population that is more directly exposed to these fluctuations in global food prices, they might think quite differently about whether they're willing to tolerate those fluctuations, and they might want to think about what strategies could be implemented countrywide or even globally to reduce those spikes. So I'm just suggesting that they're starting from a different premise. Yep. I think that's a huge and important question, and I want to make sure I'm not misunderstood. Hunger is a real problem in the developed world. It's a real problem in America. But there are two things to say about that. Number one, the 25 million figure is interesting because I'm willing to accept that that reflects a population that is not getting the access to food that they need for a variety of reasons. But there are categories of how we measure hunger, including the way we measure hunger globally, that don't overlap completely with that 25 million. So that's one point. And the second point is that part of what makes the continuing degree of hunger in the developed world a challenge is that unlike the situation in the developing world, it is no longer a problem that threatens regime stability in the sense that we can afford to ignore it and in a painful way, in a way that we shouldn't, right? So I feel like we're dealing with a different scale of problem that still calls for a great deal of engagement by civil society and by government. But we have, in part, reached this point where the broader population can sometimes cast the problem aside because we have the capacity to make sure that it affects fewer people. I think we need to do a lot more work on that, and I personally will only be doing a small piece of that. So it will call on a bunch of different people using different tools to understand this better. The areas that I'm most familiar with in terms of the large and quantitative econometric studies is the connection between food price instability and conflict. And that's actually a very, very meager literature that is only beginning to develop. And so you raise really a couple of interesting questions, and I think we need a lot more study of them. One is to disaggregate the sources of the food instability, of food price instability, and there's a greater deal of work in this area. I'm familiar with some of it. In particular, there's a ton of interest in how biofuels policy and energy policy is having an effect. But I think systemically and theoretically, it's helpful to underscore some things that we do know in addition to the things that we don't know. And I think it's fair to say we do know that a much more globally integrated system for moving food across borders and selling food across borders, while it has a bunch of different advantages, some of them relate to these sort of virtual water transfers, it does change the incentives of a lot of developing countries to develop their domestic agricultural sectors and makes them a lot less self-sufficient. And that, I think, turns what in many, many decades past was more of a domestic problem for these countries into very much of an international problem. Thank you. Okay.
Okay, actually, I'd like to ask that you please join me in one more round of applause for all of our speakers from this afternoon.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.